Today at the National Press Club, Professors Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut from the Superpower Institute. Together they'll share their vision for Australia's climate and economic policy with a focus on renewable energy. Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Laura Tingle. I'm the club president. The global conversation about climate change really took off in 2007 when English economist Nicholas Stern published a landmark paper on the economics of climate change. The power of the paper lay in the way it argued about the cost of not acting to ameliorate the impacts of climate change. But as the various parties debating climate change retreated into their trenches, internationally and domestically, we have tended to see a splintering of the discussion. That has included a tendency for a debate about the economic impact of the energy transition and of climate change to often be discussed in Australia in separate strands. Our two speakers today seek to bring the conversations about the economy and climate change back together. Both Professor Ross Garnaut and Rod Sims have made substantial contributions to the Australian debates about climate, energy and the economy. Ross Garnaut will speak to us first today. Please welcome him to the podium.
Thanks, Laura. I acknowledge the Indigenous people all over Australia upon whose land we enjoy this discussion. Their participation and leadership is essential for Australia to emerge as the zero-carbon superpower of the emerging world economy. When I spoke to the National Press Club in June 2008 and again in March 2011 about Australia doing its fair share in the global fight against climate change, my case was defensive. Short-term costs would avoid much larger long-term damage. Rod and my message today is different. Australia's circumstances are different, and the effects of early action to reduce greenhouse gases are different. Then, we were enjoying the second of 2 decades of prodigious growth in Australian living standards, the first from economic reform and the productivity boom of the 1990s, the second from the China resources boom. Now we are at the end of a decade, near the bottom on the measures that matter to ordinary Australians. Real wages are now lower than they were a decade ago. That hasn't ever happened in Australia before. My book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession, written deep in pandemic in 2020, drew attention to how Australian per capita output growth fell from near the top of the developed countries for 2 decades to near the bottom from 2013. The solution then in 2020 wasn't a return to what we were doing before the pandemic. The solution then and now is major reform to restore rising living standards for ordinary Australians. It won't be easy. There are headwinds. Real existing climate change is a headwind. When a near-cyclonic event hits a non-cyclonic area, as it did in Victoria yesterday, there is great disruption and high costs. The rest of the world's response to climate change means that 2 of our 3 largest export industries will phase out over the next few decades, whatever we decide to do ourselves. Restoring rising productivity and living standards means doing things differently. Yes, there are the same defensive reasons for stopping human-induced climate change that there used to be. But now it is clear, as it wasn't clear then, that Australia's advantages in the emerging zero-carbon world economy are so large that they define the most credible path to restoration of growth in Australian living standards. The change in our economic circumstances and the big change in economic opportunity in the zero-carbon economy mean that the best policy solutions change. The ETS recommended in 2008 and 2011 was best when the main concern was doing our fair share in the global effort at the lowest possible cost. The carbon solution levy that we propose today is better suited to securing the immense benefits for Australian living standards from building the superpower. The global transition to net zero is Australia's opportunity. Other countries do not share our natural endowments of wind and solar energy resources, land to deploy them, as well as land to grow biomass sustainably as an alternative to petroleum and coal for chemical manufacturers. In the zero carbon economy, Australia is the economically natural location to produce a substantial proportion of the products currently made with large carbon emissions in Northeast Asia and Europe. Our superpower story is increasingly recognised in Northeast Asia and Europe. In an article in the AFR last month, Angela McDonald-Smith reported from the German Ministry for Education and Research, quote, "Australia wants to be a renewable energy superpower. So this is a perfect match because Germany is a superpower in the offtake of energy." Or Michael Liebrich in Bloomberg NEF, quote, "The prohibitive cost of long-distance imports means that energy-intensive industries will inevitably migrate to regions with cheap, clean energy. It is inconceivable for any country to import iron ore from Australia or Brazil, hydrogen from Australia, the Gulf, Canada or Africa, and make steel at a globally competitive price." These perspectives have been confirmed in conversations in recent months with major business leaders in Japan and China. Last year, a team from Oxford School of Engineering Science published in Nature Communications the results of an elaborate modelling exercise defining the cost of producing iron and steel in different locations in a zero-carbon world. Australia emerges as by far the world's largest producer of iron, metal and steel, more than twice as large as any other country. Making good use of our zero-carbon opportunity makes it possible for Northeast Asia and Europe, over 2/5 of the world's emissions, to get to net zero. Reuben Finnegan at the Superpower Institute is working through the detail. Here is a taste of what will come from this work. China last year installed enough new renewable energy to supply twice the power from all sources used in Australia's national electricity market. Even if China were willing to pay twice Australia's expected costs of renewable energy in 2050, it would only satisfy half of its forecast requirements for wind and solar from its own resources. That leaves a gap of over 2,000 terawatt-hours. The cheapest way to source that immense amount of energy is by importing goods that embody renewable energy. Turning the iron ore China currently imports from Australia into metal before it is shipped would fill over a quarter of this gap. Making that iron metal in Australia would require 10 times the power now used in Australia's NEM. The constraints on domestic supply of renewable energy are even greater in Japan, Korea and Europe than in China. The processing of minerals will be the most important of the superpower industries. The South Australian Government's plans for the Upper Spencer Gulf lead the way, starting with green copper and green iron. Our main message today is that export of zero-carbon goods can underpin a long period of high investment, rising productivity, full employment and rising incomes in Australia. Our exceptional resources, legacy institutions from before 2013, the Renewable Energy Target, ARENA and the CEFC, and action by both coalition and Labor state governments kept the future alive through the Commonwealth's climate wars. Our international commitment to reduce emissions by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030 is the minimum required as a developed country to establish our credibility in the global climate effort. But we do neither the global climate effort nor our own prosperity any good if we meet our commitments in ways that block the emergence of the superpower. There are 5 pillars of national economic success today, as there were in the reform era that gave Australia its 2 world-beating decades of prosperity. These are also the 5 pillars of the superpower. The first pillar is open trade. That means Australian businesses are able to use, without unnecessary restriction, the best and lowest cost equipment and inputs to production in the world. It also means establishing open access to global markets for our zero-carbon exports. From 2026, the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism will allow Australian producers to realise a green premium for their products, so long as they can demonstrate a zero-carbon supply chain with genuine additionality, or that all relevant parts of the economy are subject to a carbon charge similar to that in the EU. Those principles will gradually spread to other importers of zero-carbon goods. We need to strengthen Australia's currently underdeveloped capacity to measure and account for carbon emissions. The second pillar is strong public finances. This is necessary for Australian producers to have access to competitive cost of capital and a competitive real exchange rate. In our small open economy, it is necessary to insulate Australia against international shocks. The budgetary demands of things that only government can do in building the superpower are large, so we should avoid expenditures on things that government doesn't have to do. The third pillar is a skilled workforce and an informed and supportive community that together are able to meet the requirements of rapid structural and technological change. The fourth pillar is a favourable environment for business investment. The fifth pillar is establishing the right balance between the role of the state and the role of competitive private markets. Only government can supply public goods, including the correction of imperfections in markets. Only government can secure efficient supply of natural monopoly infrastructure. The things that only government can do are so demanding that the rest should be left to competitive markets. The fifth pillar is the balance between the market and the state. I'll focus on a bit more because that's very close to our policy contribution today. The competitive electricity wholesale market is underpinning a storage investment boom and is helping to get superpower industry started. Our strong message: don't change the one part of the NEM that is working well. Markets only work for the community if government corrects any tendency for firms to impose costs on others without paying for them, or to confer benefits on others for which they are not rewarded. Without a carbon price, we made the correction for electricity in a second best way, through the RET. That worked well. The government is adding the CIS, which will operate with the RET until 2030 and then carry the whole load. The expanded CIS signals that the Australian government is determined to meet the decarbonisation and renewable energy targets. There are two systemic risks of the CIS. The budget risks can be ameliorated by making sure the mechanisms are in place to generate a green premium after the RET ceases in 2030, as a supplement to revenues from the sale of electricity. There will be no green premium without mandatory requirements to use green energy or some charge on carbon emissions. The second amelioration is to make sure that early and rapid development of superpower industries absorbs power when it is cheap. The second systemic risk of the CIS arises because governments are now likely to underwrite almost all renewable generation investments. In the context of a radically uncertain and rapidly changing energy transition, the most prescient public officials will get many calls wrong. Competitive private markets give better results. Officials intruding views on location, technology or timing of investments would place the CIS on a slippery slope to central planning and failure. We suggest that the government consider a generally available CIS rather than one determined by auction. A formula would determine the levels of payments from and returned to the state. This would reduce the budgetary and avoid the central planning systemic risks. Government also has to correct for the external benefits that pioneering firms confer on others when they invest in new industries and technologies. At a time of rapid change in zero-carbon energy and industry, the pioneers create knowledge from which business followers and the whole community benefit. We propose a Superpower Industries Innovation Scheme SIIS to support early investments in the new industries in a systematic manner. Government cannot afford a major role in natural monopoly infrastructure, electricity transmission and hydrogen transportation and storage. Transmission in Australia today is deeply problematic. We suggest that the Productivity Commission be asked to review electricity transmission and distribution and hydrogen transport and storage to meet the requirements of the superpower. I spoke to Stephen Chu, then President Obama's Secretary for Energy and a Nobel laureate in physics, immediately after the 2010 midterm elections had shown that the administration's favoured ETS would not pass the Congress. How will you reach your targets without the ETS, I asked. Don't worry, Ross, Stephen responded. We wanted to get there at low cost with an economically efficient mechanism. Now we will get there with less efficient, higher cost instruments. He went on to outline for me the many regulatory interventions that were unveiled over the next 6 years. The US journey had a large detour through the Trump years and has landed with the IRA. The first and second pillars of open trade and strong public finances would both be fractured by duplication of the US IRA in Australia. The IRA is turbocharging US decarbonisation. Good for the world. But its embodiment of the Trump-Biden support for eye-watering fiscal deficits and protection is making the US uncompetitive in global markets. Viewed away from the climate wars and the extraordinary history of climate policy, Australia's circumstances call for an explicit payment by firms for the damage that their emissions impose on others. We suggest consideration of a Carbon Solutions Levy, CSL. This is a levy equivalent to the European carbon price imposed on every tonne of carbon extracted from below the ground or imported into Australia. This would introduce a green premium to secure access of our zero-carbon goods into international markets. The green premium would reduce the costs of the CIS, and the revenue generated by the CSL would greatly strengthen the budget for the SIIS, natural monopoly infrastructure and other things. Sales to any country with arrangements that generate a comparable green premium from which Australian zero-carbon goods can benefit would be exempt from the CSL. That would be Europe now, and we hope by 2030 our major trading partners in Northeast Asia as well. We suggest introducing the CSL in 2030-31 in time to provide the necessary green premium for securing access to green markets and meet the greater budgetary demands of the CIS at the end of the RET. We note simply for the discussion that there are advantages in starting earlier. If introduced over the next year, there is ample rationale for using part of the funding to reduce the costs of fuel to road users and to reduce the cost of electricity substantially. This would be a circuit breaker in Australia's cost of living crisis. Inflationary expectations would fall, bringing forward interest rate cuts and reducing risks of rising unemployment. We know that the constraints from the climate wars make the implementation of the CSL impossible, but not as impossible politically as accepting continued stagnation and decline in living standards. Not as impossible as passing on to our children and grandchildren lower standards of living than our own parents and grandparents left to us. Not as impossible as living with our failure to play our full part in the global effort to stop the bushfires and cyclones and denudation of our beaches getting worse. Not as impossible as being unable to pay for our ageing population and unable to pay for our submarines. The superpower transformation can put us back on a path to higher productivity and living standards after a lost decade. To build the superpower, Australia will have to invest 5% of incomes or more for several decades. Obviously impossible, except that we did that for a decade to supply the minerals for Chinese industrial expansion between 2002 and 2012. We'll need continuity of policy over decades. Impossible. Until you recall how the Australian communities enforced consensus from the major political parties for policies that deliver benefits widely in the public interest. Medicare, remember the history. Rising employment with rising incomes, especially in rural and provincial Australia, will enforce consensus. There is no superpower without community support in regional Australia for solar farms and wind turbines. Look at Barnaby Joyce and the Angry 400 in Canberra last week. And community support is impossible. Impossible until you open your ears to the different voices in rural and provincial Australia. 0.5% or so of Australia's landmass will be required to house the solar and wind for the superpower. That's a lot of land, but we need not cover the best farmland. We need not cover the land of any people who don't want wind turbines and solar panels on their country. I've spent a lot of time in the west of Queensland since 7 mayors asked me to help them think through how they could use their sun and wind for permanent jobs. The heartland of the old Australian bush, where Clancy of the Overflow went droving. The shearers and teamsters met beneath the tree of knowledge and decided to use their new democracy to make a better country. Where Banjo wrote Waltzing Matilda, and the Queensland and Northern Territory aerial services built the planes and what is now the world's oldest international airline. Big country with big skies. They want renewable power generation if they get sustainable income and jobs. They welcome the Queensland Government's and Energy Queensland's support for a local renewable industrial precinct. Now, 11:30 Brisbane time and 12:30 in Canberra, Premier Stephen Miles is preparing to introduce a bill for a law for 75% reductions on 2000 emissions by 2035. That's great for long-term jobs in the Queensland bush.
Welcome, everybody. The Superpower Institute, which I'm very proud to chair, has been established to change the narrative on the economy and climate change in Australia. Rather than discussion of these issues occurring separately, the Superpower Institute seeks to give climate change a central role in our broader economic debate and to place climate policy in the context of the wider Australian economy. For example, Australia has active debates on productivity and tax, but no mention in those debates is made of climate change, which should be central to both of those topics. The Australian climate debate often appears to solely focus on decarbonising Australia or reducing world emissions by a bit over 1%, rather than focus on the larger role Australia can and must play in reducing world emissions by anywhere between 6 and 9%. That's a very large number. If we do not focus on the reducing world emissions by 6 to 9%, we will fail prosperity for Australians and we will fail the world's climate. Today, Ross and I are outlining the policies Australia needs to follow to achieve prosperity for Australia and for Australia making its maximum contribution to reducing world emissions. These policies integrate economic and environmental policy. Now, some of these policies are going to seem controversial. Some may even be rejected immediately. That does not matter. We've spent 6 months putting all this together. We can't expect instant understanding and acceptance. So today is the beginning of the debate, not the end. The Superpower Institute will undertake continuing research to show what is possible and what is needed in Australia. Too often in Australia, this is talking generally in terms of policy, too often Australian ideas are put forward, immediately ruled out and dropped. This will not happen here. The role of the Superpower Institute is to ensure this. We will keep tilling the soil so that these policy ideas can seed, take hold, grow and feed into the policy discourse. Tariff reduction was once strongly opposed. Eventually the debate shifted so that the tariff reductions occurred. The Industry Commission provided the facts and logic and eventually gained support for policy that has benefited Australia enormously. The Superpower Institute seeks to play its role so that Australia can realise the superpower opportunity. Now let's be clear on perhaps the most, well not perhaps, definitely the most controversial part of the policy package, the carbon solution levy. I get the fact that if you think climate change science is rubbish, then the idea of this fee is also silly. But claiming that climate change science is rubbish is actually a pretty big call. And whatever you think, all of the countries of the world have agreed to move towards net zero emissions, and most are making progress towards that goal. It happens that this creates great economic opportunities for Australia. If, like the vast majority of the world's scientists, you think climate change is real, how can you then oppose the carbon solutions levy? Basic economics means that you must price the damage that fossil carbon imposes on us all. Not to do so is to make it essentially impossible for green products to compete with currently cheaper fossil fuel products. Where is the incentive for business to bring about the transition? The safeguard mechanism is a great start and should be applauded, but at some stage we must move to a wider economy measure. The logic is, as I think everybody in this room knows, inescapable. Alternatively put, we can deal with climate change through a market mechanism or by numerous specific interventions that will achieve the same goal but a much higher cost. So today we are putting a market mechanism to deal with climate change back on Australia's agenda via the carbon solution levy proposal. And contrary to the rhetoric of the past when these issues have been debated, all Australians will clearly be winners from the levy, except, of course, fossil fuel producers who need to pay for the damage their products cause. We also have a debate about tax reform. Pricing carbon must be central to that debate. How can you have a debate on tax reform and not include pricing carbon? Pricing carbon will also help finance the inevitable compensation costs that will be required from true tax reform. We appreciate you all coming today to help us get this debate underway, and we now look forward to some questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both of you, and I'd particularly like to congratulate you on adding an acronym to the debate, because we've never had very many of those. CPRS, ETS, RET, and now we've got CSL.
It's not a new acronym, there's already one.
Well, you're putting it in the headlights. What I'd just like to ask one or both of you to do is just slow down for a moment. For a lot of us who are playing along at home, if you could just talk about how the carbon solution levy would work. I mean, Ross, you made reference to the European border adjustment system and said this would be similar to it. But can you just explain conceptually how it would be imposed on and on whom, what its impact would be on domestic versus export sort of fossil fuels, and you also mentioned that the cost of living would immediately fall, which sounded pretty attractive. So can you just talk us through, in really basic terms, how it would work?
You want to go?
The relationship to the European carbon adjustment tax is that this would make us immune from it. It would give our products free access to Europe, and they'll be putting tariffs on our competitors. So that is a wonderful ride into Europe. So that's the link with Europe. How it would work, on every tonne of carbon coming out of the ground in Australia, and that's gas and coal, a little bit of oil. It will be taxed at the European carbon price. We suggest an average of 5 years. That's 105 locations. You'd also put the levy on at the point at which imports of diesel, petrol or oil comes across the border. How much that actually affects the sales price of those products depends on complex interaction with the international markets, but all of our sums are based on the most conservative estimate that it would all be passed through. The effects of competitiveness on Australian business, we suggest an Australian CBAM like the European to look after sales in domestic markets. For sales to international markets, if you're selling to a country that doesn't have, that has equivalent mechanisms like Europe, we'd exempt it. We hope that by 2030, that rather than paying the CBAM, that Japan and Korea and China would have similar arrangements that give Australian exporters the green premium that we can get in Europe. Then we could exempt them too. On domestic costs, there is enough revenue here substantially to compensate users of electricity and roads. We suggest some ways of doing that that would actually improve the efficiency of the system at the same time as they reduce the cost of living. If you did it soon, when we've got a cost of living crisis, you could reduce the CPI, give us maybe half a year without any inflation, give the Reserve Bank no excuse for not getting on with the job of reducing interest rates, and reduce that horrible risk hanging over Australia of rising unemployment.
And this would replace all the existing things like road user charges, taxes on the existing PRRT, those sorts of things, and tariffs?
We're suggesting that you could... So, look, the Carbon Solutions Levy is essentially a transfer from fossil fuel companies to the 27 million Australian population. So everyone's a winner except the fossil fuel companies. There is a lot of money that would come from this levy that would allow you to not only compensate users of electricity and other products for any cost increase, it would allow you to give them, we're saying $440 off their electricity bill, but it could be more. It allows you to get rid of petrol and diesel excise, so that drivers would be paying 30 cents a litre less on their fuel. As Ross indicated, it would mean that you'd reduce the CPI significantly. So it's really a question of how you use the proceeds. If I could just say something else about this, the European mechanism, it is really important for everyone to understand that in 2026, Europe is going to impose a border charge. So if you're bringing in steel or, let's say, iron metal made out of fossil fuel, you're going to have to pay a charge on the carbon embedded in that product made with fossil fuel. On the other hand, if you're bringing in green iron made with renewable energy and hydrogen, you won't pay the charge. In that world, green hydrogen will outcompete green iron will outcompete fossil iron. So there's no question that the green products can be economic if you appropriately impose some fee on the damage done by fossil fuels.
Simon Gross has a question.
Thanks for your speeches. I just want to drill down a bit into the Superpower Institute. You were formed in April last year. You've been flying under the radar pretty well.
Sorry about that.
No.
Which we're working on.
I had a look at your website. You say you're non-profit. There's no mention of sponsors or sources of funding. I noticed that one of your directors is Simon Holmes a Court. So
Happily sitting over here, yes.
Could you explain? Or give us a rundown of where you're funded, and are you a Teal think tank?
Certainly not. We our directors are people who are interested in what we're doing, and Simon, as well as the other directors, is interested in what we're doing and trying to realise the superpower opportunity. So it's a board of people who are committed to doing that. As to the funders, the vast majority have insisted that their contributions be anonymous. So there's nothing much we can do about that except say, no, we won't take your money. That'd be a rather silly thing to do. So I'm afraid we cannot mention who the sponsors are, but they are philanthropic organisations that are interested in the thesis we're putting forward about the opportunity for Australia from climate change.
Okay.
David Spears.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you both for your speech today and the new ideas in the debate. You've both been pretty frank in your pessimism about either side of politics, initially taking up the idea of the carbon solutions levy. Can I ask you about something the government is doing, though, and that's taking a bit of a bet, or quite a significant bet, on hydrogen. So are some in the private sector as well, but particularly hydrogen exports. Am I right in saying you seem to be arguing we're better off focusing on local green manufacturing of metals and fuels and so on, rather than exporting hydrogen to the world? Are we on the? Is this a bad bet the government's taking at the moment on exporting hydrogen?
I'll have a start and then Ross can join. Just on the pessimism about acceptance of the ideas, it just happens to be the way. I mean, any time anyone mentions any increase in any tax whatsoever, they get jumped upon. So it's nothing so much about the proposals we're putting forward, it's just the dynamics of political debate. And I think, you know, if anybody in this room put themselves in the position of Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton, you'd react in the same way, just because of the way the debate is unfolding. But these issues always take time to permeate through. They have to be communicated very well. Look, on hydrogen, we see the main use of hydrogen as a chemical input into production processes. So if you want to make green iron, you need hydrogen to reduce the iron ore to iron metal. Likewise, if you want to make urea, silicon, transport fuel, you need hydrogen. Now, Ross might add, he's probably got, well, certainly does have superior technical knowledge on this, but hydrogen is extremely expensive to export and very, very difficult to export. So it makes sense to use the hydrogen in Australia and put it into the goods that you then export. Indeed, if I could just spend a second on this, at the moment we export iron ore, we export metallurgical coal, and we export gas. And that makes perfect sense in the fossil economy world. When you're trying to make green metal, though, you do need renewable energy, you do need hydrogen. They're very difficult to export, they're very expensive to export. So the economics flip. That's what's changing here. We're not talking about, wouldn't it be great to process more products in Australia? That's not what we're saying. We're saying the economics have flipped. It now makes economic sense to make green metal in Australia, whereas before it made sense to export the iron ore. So hydrogen is such a central component of making all the goods we're talking about. If there's any over for export, that's fine, but we need a hell of a lot of hydrogen to make the green exports that we're talking about.
Yeah, just on why it makes more sense to use it here. I get my chemistry from high school, Perth Modern School, where they taught it very well more than half a century ago. A lot more. Hydrogen's the smallest molecule. It seeps out between the molecules of ordinary steel. You need special materials. You can do it. It's expensive. It won't liquefy till you get temperature down almost to absolute zero, minus 250 degrees. The closer you get to absolute zero, the more energy you need to get further. Quite different from methane, natural gas, which will liquefy it at minus 150 degrees. So it's going to cost twice as much to use Australian hydrogen in Japan as to use it here. Whereas if you send metallurgical coal from Mackay to Kobe, it'll only cost 5% more, and that's actually cheaper than putting it on a coastal boat to take it around to Whyalla. The Japanese steel industry will not be internationally competitive if it uses hydrogen that's more than twice as expensive as somewhere else. So the Japanese government, the European governments are committed to promoting imports of hydrogen. That's great. That will be quite a substantial business in Australia, and we should make whatever use of it we can. If we can do that profitably, good. But the really powerful economic forces are going to drive the users of iron in Japan, in Korea, in China, in Europe, to buy processed material from Australia.
Rosie Lewis.
Rosie Lewis from The Australian. I'm very interested in how Rod Sims' briefing to Treasury went yesterday, but assuming that might be a pointless exercise in asking you that question, I wanted to know from both of you how you overcome the political impasse of a carbon tax. Do we actually need to be shocked into action, a budget disaster, we don't meet our emissions targets, or do we actually, in fact, need a more progressive parliament before we could consider such an idea like the CSL again? Do we need more Greens MPs who have just backed your proposal? Do we need more Teals MPs who are in the room today?
In my view, we just need better understanding of the issues. We just need to debate them, to discuss them. I've got many hot button issues, as anyone who knows me knows, but perhaps my biggest one is we just don't have the debates that we should have. We let the debates drop too quickly. We need to have this debate. We need to understand the issues. These are complex issues. I think when more and more people understand the promise here, the need for funding, that this is a very obvious way to do the funding, then that will change the political discourse and we'll get the right outcome. But it's a matter of discussion, debate, information, and that's what we're about. And I'm very confident that at some stage this will get adopted. I just can't tell you when.
Ross, did you want to add, or?
What he said. Ben Westcott.
Thank you very much for your speech. It's Ben Westcott from Bloomberg, and I've got good news. The Greens have announced they support your CSL, so
that's one good, isn't it?
You're basically there. I wanted to talk to you about your plan. In recent months, we've seen a number of green metals producers in Australia, particularly in Western Australia, face troubles, face issues. Falls in global prices have sparked crisis talks with the minister, and these are largely private companies with largely well-developed technologies, and yet they're still facing difficulties. Now, under your plan, we're looking at a bigger bet with public money on new technologies, possibly even very, very new technologies. Does that highlight the risks of this sector in a big way?
Look, mining always has its ups and downs. You're talking about some prices, I think, of things like copper and lithium, particularly due to what's going on in Indonesia. I think if you're in the mining business, you're used to prices going up and down, and so I think that's just a part of the trend of mining. I don't think it affects what we're talking about. When you're talking about green iron and green aluminium and urea and silicon, they have much more stable prices, and the comparative advantage that Australia has in making them will, I think, sustain us well into the future. The comparative advantage is so strong that I don't anticipate anything like the same problems that lithium and copper are facing at the moment.
Yeah. The crisis that's been discussed is a fall in the lithium price, a fall in the nickel price, partly due to big expansion of production of those products overseas, nickel in Indonesia. Yes, as Rod said, that's a mining issue. Australia's good at mining. Mining prices go up and down, and our companies can handle that. Whenever price is low, they have a crack at the government to see if they can get a few bob out of it. And if government gives in to them every now and again, it's worth them having a crack at government. But that's just normal mining business. We're talking about the processing element being the superpower element, and all of those minerals can be processed. The recent statement by the Premier of South Australia on the green copper region of South Australia was forward-looking and soundly based. That's a good example of it. I noticed that our Minister for Resources was saying our products should get a green premium because our products are cleaner than the Indonesian nickel. That may be so. We will get a green premium. She will get what she thinks we need if we have a genuinely zero carbon supply chain and the type of mechanism we're talking about. Then Australian nickel and Australian lithium will go straight into Europe without any charge, and those poor old Indonesians will be paying the border tax.
Thanks very much.
Julie Hare has a question.
Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. Thank you both for your speech. I'm just wondering about recent news. Yesterday's weather in Victoria caused major outages for large numbers in the state. Does that undermine the transition to green energy, given the fact that these sorts of weather events aren't going to stop any time in the near future, whether transmission lines are carrying green energy or coal-powered energy?
If you put enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you have more cyclonic type events, even in areas that didn't used to have cyclonic type events. Victoria had one yesterday. If it knocks down transmission lines, it knocks out the power, whether it's carrying renewable energy or power from the dirtiest power stations in the world down in the Latrobe Valley. It's a neutral issue. Climate change is dangerous for stability of power systems wherever the power comes from, and the only way to stop that is to stop climate change getting worse.
Thank you.
David Crowe.
Thank you both for your remarks. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. Inevitably, in this kind of debate, the cry goes up that you are, with your proposal, going to run Australian industries into the ground with losses to their revenue, driving them out of business, and with job losses as well. With the CSL, what's your response to the claim that this will mean LNG production in Western Australia won't be economic, they won't invest in new gas fields, they won't be producing, or that coal will not be economic, they won't be exporting? It does look like your model relies on the continued export of fossil fuels or production of fossil fuels because that's where you raise the money from in the first place. Does the model for the CSL envisage the phasing out of those fossil fuel industries and then a fall in the revenue that you make from the CSL over time as you get that transition? I'm just interested in how that model would work.
Yeah, look, to pick up the last point, certainly as the fossil fuels phase out, the new industries will take over, so that won't be a problem. Look, this is an unambiguous plus for jobs, not in any way a minus. The levy we accept is a significant impost on fossil fuel companies, but they will keep producing. We have this amazing debate at the moment when someone wants to start a new coal mine or a new gas field. It puts the approving minister in a very tricky position. What we're saying is if the carbon solution levy is in place, they're paying their way. If they want to proceed with the levy, fine. If the levy prohibits them proceeding, well then they probably shouldn't proceed. So I don't see the problem at all. And as I say, for jobs, you won't get any immediate reduction in jobs in those fossil fuel industries because they'll continue. Yes, you might have less of them in the future, but you're going to have less of them in the future anyway. Demand for fossil fuels by any prediction is going down. The jobs that will be created from the industries we're talking about will absolutely be immense, and they'll mainly be in the region. So we won't be worrying about unemployment, we'll be worrying about where we get the workers from.
And all of our calculations presume that revenue will be falling from 2030 because production of coal and gas will be falling.
Melissa Code.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. My question was about the point Professor Garnaut made about the need for continuity of policy over the decades. When I sort of take a step back and listen to the discourse, I think there's a group of engaged citizens who are very interested in what happens in the policy sense in this post-carbon global economic order. But then there are others who would find the most resonating thing that was said today was the reference to Clancy of the overflow. So my question is, how do we sort of convey to the citizens at large that those two issues aren't mutually exclusive when it comes to the public interest?
That's our job in the Superpower Institute, and we're not going to stop till we've done it.
I missed actually the two issues. Sorry, but pardon my.
Yeah, so there's a group who are very aware and alive about the issues of being
Yes.
competitive in the post-carbon global economic order.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are others in the community who find much more resonance with Clancy of the overflow and what that means for the national interest. And I asked that question because I was standing on the front part of Parliament House listening to some of the protesters last week and really trying to understand the feeling, because a lot of them do believe very vehemently that some of the ideas that you share are a threat, an existential threat.
Sorry, I was too brief.
Yes.
Yes, there are different views. And the main points that I made in my presentation were, first, we only need to use a bit more than 0.5% of the Australian landmass. No one needs to cover good farmland with solar panels. No one needs to have wind turbines on solar panels or solar panels on their land if they don't want to. You asked about how can we get continuity of policy and consensus. Sometimes you only get consensus once the community has decided something's in the public interest. I mentioned Medicare. Medicare was introduced by the Whitlam government. It was pretty popular. Fraser got rid of it. Hawke brought it back. For the next 4 elections, the Liberal National Party promised to get rid of it, and they lost. And the 5th election, John Howard promised to keep it, and they won. That's how we'll get consensus on these issues.
And could I just add, most of the superpower industries will be located well away from the current electricity grid, the current farmlands. You're talking where the solar energy is, that's largely up north. You're talking where the iron ore is, that's in the Pilbara, that's in South Australia. So these industries are going to be well away from, you won't have to worry about farms. They won't be dependent on wind farms offshore New South Wales. I mean, if we want to have those things, fantastic. And if the communities of Victoria and New South Wales want to be involved in these industries, fantastic. But if they don't, most of the best solar is in the north of the country. That's where most of this will occur. This is an absolute boon for the regions. And as Ross said, if people don't want it in their backyard, there's plenty of room left in everybody else's backyard.
Anthony Galloway.
Anthony Galloway from Capital Brief. The Federal Coalition has put nuclear energy back on the agenda, saying it will investigate ways to make nuclear a key part of Australia's future energy mix. Has that horse bolted in both of your view, or is it worthy to look at nuclear?
Look, as far as we're concerned, if you want to make any of the products we're talking about by using nuclear energy rather than renewable energy, fine. By any arithmetic at the moment, nuclear energy is so much more expensive than renewable energy. I mean, just if you're in the northern part of Australia and you want to make hydrogen, for example, you need a lot of renewable energy to separate the H from the O and get the hydrogen. You don't need those electrolysers to run all the time. You can turn them off when the sun's not shining. You can probably get that energy to those electrolysers at something like $20 or $30 a megawatt hour. Nuclear energy is just nowhere near that. I mean, it's a 10 times multiple of that, if not more. So if people want to use nuclear, fine, but it's, at the moment, on what we know now, massively out of the money.
Jane Norman.
Hello, Jane Norman from the ABC. Thank you for your address today. I wanted to stick with the power issue and noting, Professor Garnaut, your comments earlier about the wholesale pricing within the NEM. Don't want to go into that in too much detail, but last week we were offered another view on the electricity market by one of your predecessors at the ACCC. Alan Fells really took aim at the electricity sector, saying it's highly concentrated, it's not fit for purpose, substantial price gouging is taking place, and that at every level, whether it be generation, transmission and retail, prices are simply too high. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on this. Are Australians paying too much for power right now? Do you believe there is a need for intervention or more competition in the market, and what will bring down prices, I suppose, in the short term as we transition away from fossil fuels?
Well, one thing that will bring it down is the more renewable energy we've got, the lower the power prices will be. It's not renewable energy that's put up power prices, it's very much rising gas, coal and gas prices, and also the higher network prices we've got. So if we want to get prices for electricity down, which we must do, I mean, Australia 20 years ago had the lowest cost just about the lowest cost electricity in the world, and we don't now. And we should be a low-cost country. What we've got to do is relook at the way we deal with the electricity networks, because now the network costs, both distribution and transmission, is a massive part of people's bills, and we need to rethink how we're pricing that, how we're charging for that, particularly as we get more solar panels. There's a massive amount of work to be done to get those prices down. We need to, as I say, get more renewable energy in the system because that's the cheapest. In terms of what Alan was talking about, of course there has been a lack of competition because we've had three main players in the retail market. As we get more renewable energy into the system, I think that will just unwind naturally. It's important as we do the transition that we keep an eye on making sure we've got enough competition, we don't make the mistakes of the past, but I think that will unwind naturally. So focus on the regulation, keep the renewable energy coming, that will sort it.
May I ask a follow-up, sorry?
Yep.
On the transmission element, we know that the distribution costs are about 40% of a power bill, and that the companies building the 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines between now and 2050 will have a return. Won't that just continue to add pressure on power bills? Won't that continue to sort of increase power bills even as wholesale prices might decline?
You want to do that on that?
You do.
Okay. Look, what's happened is we've had the asset base of the network companies has gone up enormously relative to the usage of power. And this is something we really have to look at, which is why we're recommending the Productivity Commission have a decent look at it. There's no reason why the transmission should be a problem in and of itself. I mean, connecting up more transmission means you're connecting up more sources of power. But the way we regulate it is a problem. The fact that I mean, for the superpower industries, what we're recommending is the government plays a bigger role, invests ahead of demand. But for the existing sector in the East Coast electricity grid, I think we're paying too much for our poles and wires, and we need to rethink the way we regulate it, because at the moment, as you get declining use, you're going to have power prices going up, and we really can't put up with that. So there's a decent look needs to be had at the way we regulate transmission and distribution.
Could I just butt in there a bit, because I was going to ask something similar. Ross, and you've just referenced the Productivity Commission review about regulation, but you seem to be saying in your talk, Ross, that there should be a bigger government role in establishing a transmission network in the future. I just wasn't clear about that.
Yeah,
government
transmission and also hydrogen transportation and storage are natural monopolies.
Yes.
Back in 1991, when the Productivity Commission did a report that recommended that we break up the old state electricity commissions, Rod was Deputy Secretary looking after economic policy in the Prime Minister's Department. That's
a while ago.
33 years ago. The Productivity Commission said there's very big gains to be had from privatising generation, because you can have competition. There's very big gains to be had from privatising retail because you can have competition. But the natural monopoly policy were not necessarily gains. Now we got a bit too enthusiastic about privatisation. We forgot the economics. The economics always said be careful about the natural monopolies. Well, I'm saying be careful again. Don't make mistakes of the past. That will mean there's an inevitable role for government. If government's not owning them, government has to, in every detail, regulate what investment takes place, what price they can charge. Government is in this area of the natural monopoly. There's no way out. We've got views on that. If the government sets up a productivity commission, probably Rod and I will put a view to the Productivity Commission, but we're saying it needs root and branch review and reform.
But just to clarify, you're still just essentially talking about regulation rather than, for example, government sort of buying back some of the transmission mechanisms or
well, we've got very different stories in the whole of Australia. And in Queensland and West Australia, Tasmania, 3 states, you've still got public ownership. Queensland's gone ahead and used very effectively revenue that it took from the coal industry when the Ukraine war sent prices way up. Used part of that to reduce people's electricity bills, part of that to improve health services, and part to invest in transmission. Well, that's easy because they've still got state ownership. It's harder in the places that are privatised. The electricity system in the superpower will be 30 times as big as the current electricity system. So we can't let the problems of what's there now, the pimple, distort what we do about the whole system. Government's got a big role in the whole system. What we do about the existing desperate problem in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, we've asked the Productivity Commission to sort out.
Nick Stewart.
Great speech, interesting idea. Ben Westacott says that the Greens are already behind it. Looking around here, the Teals, I'm sure, would be positive, but that still leaves a huge amount of entrenched opposition. At the moment, business makes money from not making things here, but from exporting raw materials overseas. How is it that you're going to be able to change that? Particularly, what you're trying to do is actually shape a new Australia, shift the way we're producing things. How can you do this, particularly in a country where a Deputy Prime Minister could be found in the gutter and where you're just dealing with 2 political parties who are getting calls at the moment from their constituents who are saying, oh, we're suffering from climate change. We need the money spent on us now, not on some future industry by 2030.
The point is the economics have changed. The point is that, as I said earlier, it makes sense to export iron ore, metallurgical coal, gas, thermal coal, so you can make the iron metal overseas in the current world. When you need green iron metal, the economics mean you make it here. Now, what you need is the price signal, and that's why the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is so important. They are going to be putting a carbon tariff on goods that come in to Europe, very big market, in 2026. That really opens up the opportunity, for example, for green iron. Green iron will outcompete fossil fuel-made iron into Europe because of that border adjustment. So you've already got the price signal. What we're suggesting is you need a bit of innovation support in Australia to get, because this is the technology's there, but it's not being done at scale. So we're suggesting a bit of incentive from the government. But if that incentive scheme is there, plus you've got the European mechanism, the private sector will do the rest. So we're not talking about anything terribly radical here. The economics have changed. That's the key point. This isn't process more in Australia as some sort of mantra. No, the economics change when you start making green products.
And on the politics of the impossible, yes, obviously it's impossible to introduce policy in the Australian public interest. Obviously it's impossible to do something that will end a decade stagnation in living standards. Obviously that's impossible. We wouldn't have real wages lower now than in 2013 if it wasn't impossible to do something about it. But on March the 4th, 1983, Bob Hawke rang me to have a yarn about being his economic advisor. And we talked then about the macroeconomic story, the 10% unemployment and 12% inflation that we had. And we talked about protection. He said, I know it wasn't in our policy to get rid of protection, but one of the reasons I want you to work for me is what you've been writing about that for the last 10 years. And he said, we can't do it tomorrow. We'll start educating people tomorrow. I'll be making speeches explaining the advantages of it, how it will give us a generation of rising real wages and living standards. But we won't drop it on them without them understanding what's going on. We won't do what Whitlam did with his 25% tariff cut, which no one understood. It came out of a clear blue sky. He said, we won't start doing it until people have confidence that employment's rising, because if people are anxious about their living standards, they're going to be afraid of change and won't listen. Now, I just finished a manuscript of a book with Kim Anderson now at Adelaide University. We were both at the ANU in those days, which basically said, this is what we should do, but it's impossible. Hawke and I, the day after the 83 election, talked about this impossible thing. To be honest, at the end of the conversation, I agreed to work for him, but still thought it was impossible. He didn't, and he did it.
So we can achieve the impossible.
That's right.
Misha Schubert.
Just a very quick one to finish up. Misha Schubert is a director of the National Press Club. Most big or complicated new policy ideas typically don't survive scrutiny or aren't successful unless you can, in a tight, pithy pitch, summarise your arguments about what's the business case, what's the BAU case, what's business as usual, what's the scenario for Australia, and what's the scenario if Australia does embrace the policy prescription you've both identified today in some really thoughtful remarks. So, opportunity, just down the barrel of the camera. Give Australians your best, tightest pitch. What happens if we don't do these things? What happens if we do these things?
If we don't do these things, we're letting down Australian prosperity and we're letting down the world's climate. We are fortunate that we've got the best solar, wind, biomass resources in the world to make these products. If we don't take advantage of it, we're letting everybody down. If we do take advantage of it, we're going to have full employment, rising standard of living. It's going to be, it absolutely is the right way for Australia to go.
Well, we love ideas and debate here at the National Press Club, so please thank Ross Garnaut and Rod Sims for giving us